In our discussion of the tabernacle, we're looking at how the tabernacle is shown to Moses in the mount. He basically shows Moses the layout of heaven. And the tabernacle is a reflection of the way heaven is laid out. There's a procession to the throne, and everything in going into the tabernacle and up to the mercy seat, that reflects the approach to God in heaven. And of course, there's only one way to approach God in heaven, and that's through the blood of Christ. For any mortal being that is a sinner, the holy angels can approach God. They stand before the throne saying, "Holy, holy, holy." They don't go through the blood because they're not fallen, but we're fallen. We're sinners and sinful, and we can only approach God through the blood. By the way, fallen angels, those who have sinned, are not welcome there. They are cast out of heaven, and there is no blood atonement for them. So this shows God's special favor for humanity. And the tabernacle reflects that he chose to dwell among humanity. So we're talking about the approach, and that bronze altar is in the courtyard. Let's talk about, so when a worshiper comes to the tabernacle, they come and there are different offerings that they bring based on, or certain offerings that are associated with certain feasts. Matt next week is going to be covering the feast. It'll be Matt's last Sunday with us, and I've asked him to teach on the feast, and that's an important thing. The feasts like Passover, Pentecost, and then for Jews, the most important one. Christians look at Passover, we think of that as the most important one, and it probably is. But a Jew thinks of Sukkot as the most important one. That is the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. That's a really important feast. So you're going to learn about those next week. But and some of these offerings are associated with certain of the feast, but some of them, most of them, are available at any time. So when someone comes to the tabernacle, they might bring one or several offerings. What are the offerings that were offered at the altar? The first one is the grain offering. That is, this is a way of showing that your thanksgiving to God for the harvest. And they would bring a grain offering would be an offering of cakes or wafers or fine flour. The burnt offering would be of bulls and sheep and goats and doves or pigeons, depending on several things we're going to see. First of all, like, how do you know which one of those to bring? Depends on who you are. Let's say that the whole congregation of Israel falls into sin, like they did at Mount Sinai. The people sat down to eat and rose up to play. Euphemistically tells about their sin and their worshiping the golden calf. So if the whole congregation of Israel sins, they were to offer a bull. If a leader sins, he was to offer a bull. Fascinating, isn't it, that the sin of a leader was equivalent to the sin of the entire congregation. Most people, when they came, offered sheep or goats. If they're poor, they don't own any sheep or goats, they could bring doves or pigeons and offer those. And if they're traveling later in the temple, if they're coming from afar, let's say Greece or Rome, they're coming across the Mediterranean, it's not practical to bring these things. They could buy them at the temple. So you had quite a trade that sort of grew up around it to allow people to buy these things when they arrived. The original design is that they bring them, but we're always looking for sort of instant and self-serve, and they did that at the temple as well. So the burnt offering, if you offered a burnt offering, that was a bull, sheep, goats, doves, or pigeons. A peace offering was a goat or a lamb. This obviously emphasized that you were a shalom peace is the word also for health and well-being. And so this was an offering that emphasized you're at peace with God, peace with others, and that would be you would offer a goat or a lamb. And then the sin offering is to be a bull or a lamb. That would be offered, a sin offering would be offered at the feast. But also, if you fell into sin and you felt the guilt of your sin and wanted to make atonement for that, you would take a bull or a lamb at any other time during the year. So the trespass offering was of a female from the flock. A trespass offering is when you violate the law. It's not necessarily like a trespass offering would be something to purify, be a purification ritual. You violated the law in some way. It's not necessarily a thing that is inherently immoral, but God has said in the law you don't do that. And so you've committed a trespass. You've violated the law because it's against the law of Moses. Something like, mixing wool and linen or something. You did something, whether purposely or inadvertently, and you broke the law, then you would offer a trespass offering, which would be a lamb, a goat, a kid, a dove, a pigeon, or grain. And this is what, like Leviticus chapters 1 through 6 are all about the trespass offering. And it's mentioned in Hebrews, but basically Hebrews is looking at the totality of all these offerings. And the book of Hebrews really makes the case that it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to atone for sin. And that was never, ever God's plan. That God never said, that sin is put away by offering these animals. Why? Because first of all, you got to keep doing it, right? There has to be another offering. And, if you're saved by your works, by offering these animals, then, you better hope you die soon after your last offering. Because if there's time between your last offering and your death and you sin in there, is there something you didn't offer sacrifice for? So again, this is why the Bible clearly makes the case that we're not saved by the act of offering these sacrifices. We're saved by faith in what this represents. So in the Old Testament, they're still saved by faith that God is going to provide a sacrifice, that a Messiah is going to come. And we're going to see this in the book of Daniel. As we're studying Daniel, keep this in mind, because in Daniel chapter 9, when God gives Daniel the vision of the 70 weeks, he tells them that in the middle of the 70th week, a prince is going to come who's going to make an end of the sacrifices. That he's going to abolish the sacrifices, that there'll be no more sacrifices. Well, what does the book of Hebrews tell us? Well, that was fulfilled in Christ. That this man, when he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. So you should not lose sight of the fact that all of these sacrifices are temporary. And they're all simply pointing to the great sacrifice. They themselves do not atone for sin. They don't make peace with God. They represent that God made a covenant with himself on behalf of humanity to forgive sin through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So the trespass offering represents that you violated the law. The sin offering and the guilt offering, like if you look at Leviticus 4, you'll see how the sin offering represents. Let's just look at, all right. First of all, in verse 2, the Lord says to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, if it is the anointed priest who sins, all right, so here's the category of you can sin with good intentions. You can mean to do the right thing and do the wrong thing. And so God says, okay, if you sin unintentionally, it's not rebellion, but it's still sin. Yeah, there's a degree in which the intentional rebellious sin is worse, but it's also true that any sin separates you from God. So here he talks about the unintentional sin. Well, what do you have to do? Well, you bring, like verse 4, if this is a priest, he shall bring the bull to the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. And he tells exactly how he goes through it. And then what, for instance, just what this sacrifice represents. Look at, so you lay the priest is to lay his hand on the head of the bull and kill the bull before the Lord. And the anointed priest shall take some of the blood of the bull and bring it into the tent of meeting. All right, so he takes some of the blood and takes it into the tent of meeting, so into the tabernacle, dips his finger in the blood and sprinkles part of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. So he goes in front of the holy place, and there he sprinkles the blood 7 times. In front of the veil. And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of incense before the Lord that is in the tent of meeting. All the rest of the blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering. That's the entrance of the tent of meeting. So if we go, let me see if I can go back to right, there's the altar, but let me get back to the courtyard if I can find it. So when someone brings, like, if someone sins, a leader sins unintentionally, he's got to bring his offering in, and there they kill it, and then they take some of the blood, and then comes here before the veil. That's the outer veil. It's not the inner veil that was torn in two. It's the outer veil. And the priest sprinkles it 7 times there. And then he takes the rest and he puts some of the blood on the horns of the altar. See these 4 horns of the altar? They would put blood there on the horns of the altar. And the rest of the blood he pours out at the base of the altar of burnt offering. And then he takes the fat and removes it, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, the loins, the long lobe of the liver, he'll remove that, and the priest will burn them on the altar of offering. But the skin of the bull and all its flesh with its head, its legs, its entrails, and its dung, all the rest of the bull, he carries outside the camp to a clean place, to the ash heap, and shall burn it up on a fire of wood. On the ash heap it shall be burned up. Now, it's interesting to see this one, that there's nothing that the priest or anyone consumes in this offering. There are some where God says, okay, the priest gets to keep a part of this. It's the same way that in the New Testament they say those that share the gospel should live of the gospel. And the priest lived off of their sharing in some of the offerings that the Israelites brought. They and their family, there was a big hook that they got to put in on certain offerings and pull out the meat after it cooked. Now remember, they're never allowed to eat raw meat. No blood can be left in the meat. The life is in the blood, Leviticus says. And so after that meat's on there's a, say, wire mesh kind of thing on the altar, the priest would put in a hook and rip it off, and what he gets, he keeps. So it's like part of this is for the Lord, part of it is for the priest. But notice for the sin offering, there's none of that. It's 100% for God. they are, it's like they're giving this, and in this offering, God wanted to picture that he alone is to have satisfaction for their sin. That he alone has the power of judgment. And so if the leader sins unintentionally, that's what they do. In verse 13, it says, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and again, they take it outside the camp. Remember when we saw the picture of how big the camp is, all the 12 tribes, they got to go a far piece. They've got to go way outside the camp, and there's a place where then they would burn it all. And it's showing, again, the picture of God removing our sin from us. And then verse 22, when a leader sins. In verse 27, if any one of the common people sins unintentionally. Then in verse 1 of chapter 5, if anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he's a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet he does not speak, he'll bear his iniquity. Well, there's a sin of silence, of not speaking up when you know the truth, and it goes through how the sin offering that he gives. Then verse 14 begins the laws of the guilt offerings, and all of this goes through how the Lord is to receive atonement of their sin. No, I'm not. Let me see. I've lost my. All right, yeah. Here, it makes the point. In some cases, in some of these offerings, some sin offerings, the meat could be eaten by the priest, because since the priests were full-time tabernacle workers, sacrificed animals was their main source of food. Through the centuries, you see at different times priests abusing this. Like the most egregious examples are Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. And boy, I mean, they're bad news all the way around. They take people's offerings, they rape women. It says that, they're lying with women who come there to offer their sacrifices, and they're wicked guys, and the Lord kills them. God provides for his priest. As is often the case, though, the human heart is very, very wicked and very selfish, and they want more than God's provision. Anytime God provides for us and we say, oh, no, that's not enough. What you've provided is not enough, and I want what someone else has. That becomes a problem, and they were guilty of that. But God provided for the priest. In many ways, the nation had to care for them, and part of it was through the offerings. A burnt offering is discussed in Leviticus chapter 1, and this sacrifice represents complete dedication and surrender to God. And it's to be a male without blemish. It is to be representative of bearing the worshiper's sins. This burnt offering dies in the place of the worshiper, and after the offering is made and the blood is sprinkled on the altar, the animal is completely burned. None of it is for roasting or eating. It's not shared. The grain offering is in Leviticus 2, and the grain offering is an offering of grain. Now, in the ancient world, this is not uncommon in a lot of Near Eastern religions, that they give drink offerings and grain offerings sort of to show their thanksgiving for the harvest. The Israelites do this. So they have the grain offering is you bring of the first fruits of your harvest, and this is in Leviticus chapter 2, and the offering is given to God in thankfulness. The people bring fine flour, unleavened cakes, or roasted grain to the priest, and the priest would burn a symbolic handful at the altar, but they would keep the rest. So part of it is to God, and the majority of that was kept by the priest. But the Israelites saw to it that, whatever the first fruits was, they wanted to take their first fruits to God. And this was for care of the priest and to show their gratitude to God. And the priest then take it, burn a handful of it on the altar, and then they keep the rest. There's very little ceremony involved with this. It really simply is, here, we brought this for you. The priest takes a handful, throws it in the altar, and takes the sack into wherever they kept their stores. And that's the grain offering. A fellowship or a peace offering is in Leviticus chapter 3. This offering symbolized fellowship and peace with God through shed blood. And you would take the meat, it was ceremonially waved toward heaven, but then it was given to the priest, and worshipers and their guests could share in the feast as a meal with God. So the sin offering pictures God's judgment on sin, but the peace offering pictures our communion with God, our fellowship with God. So it's a meal. You're celebrating something. You could bring guests with you. The priest shared in it, and the worshiper and whatever guests they brought, especially, if you're, let's say you're a fairly wealthy guy and you've got herds and you offer, let's say an ox. Well, two people aren't going to eat an ox. You'd bring a lot of people with you and would observe a meal there. And by the way, this is one reason why when Jerusalem becomes the capital and the temple is set up there, during the feast, the population swells sometimes as much as 7 times its normal population. And so people are always taking people in, but part of your ability to take people in is you get to share in what they offer. So the peace offering is one of those ways that you can pay back a host you're staying with and share your good stuff with others. And after they would take the meat and ceremonially wave it toward heaven, and then that would be given to the priest and the worshipers and their guests to share in a feast and a meal with God. And of course, I think this is clearly symbolic. Jesus talks about banqueting in heaven, and we're going to sit down with Abraham. People from the north, the south, the east, and the west will sit down and share in the meal. Jesus talks a lot about banquets and fellowship. When Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where's Lazarus carried? Right to Abraham's side. Where they reclined at a table. And this whole theme of reclining in fellowship is a major theme in the Gospels. And it should not be lost on us even that when Jesus comes and is a baby, the verb, recline is the typical verb for eating with people. You recline at table, hey, let's sit down and have a bite. And they would recline at table because they didn't use chairs. They lay out sort of sideways at a very low table and typically eat with one hand and support themselves with the other, or put food into this hand and eat like this. And so this is how John leans on Jesus' breast, and how Lazarus is carried to Abraham's breast, his bosom, as the King James says. It just means they're reclined at table beside each other. And Jesus pictures this, that this is what heaven is. It's reclining at table, that there's fellowship, that heaven is, in essence, the peace offering. Christ's offering is just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus gives his life to establish peace. God made him to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So you see how the peace offering pictures what Christ did for us so that we can have fellowship with him and with one another. And life on earth for the believer is basically spiritual rehearsal for heaven. We should have peace with one another. As much as lies in you, be at peace with all men, the Bible says. And we should be characterized as a people of peace because Christ established peace. He's given us the ministry of what? Of reconciliation. And so we should be a people who are reconciled to God, reconciled to one another. God is in Christ reconciling the world to himself. He's given us the ministry of reconciliation. All this is, I think, pictured in this peace offering and in the reality that we live. Now, the bronze laver, just beyond, in the courtyard, just beyond the bronze altar, is this bronze laver or wash basin. And remember, it was made from the mirrors of the women. So the rest of the steps of the tabernacle past that altar were performed by priests, by Levites, on behalf of the people. So after making the sacrifice, the priest then had to wash himself at the laver. And that laver purified the priest and prepared him to enter into the tabernacle. There you see it. So you see, so the priest comes and he looks into that. He sees his reflection in the bronze, and it is to show that how the Word shows us our sinfulness. The Word in the New Testament even. So the Greek word for mirror is isoptron. And where does that word isoptron show up? It's really always in conjunction with the Word, the washing of the water by the Word. And James talks about we look into the mirror, the isoptron of the Word. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 says, now we look through and it's usually translated glass, darkly, but the word is, guess what? It's a isoptron. It's a mirror, because a mirror was either bronze or glass, and he said we look through this glass darkly, but then we'll look face to face. So what we have now is the mirror of the Word. The Word tells us, I'm unclean, I'm undone, I'm a man of unclean lips. Well, the bronze laver pictures the Word of God beautifully, because you see that imagery picked up in the New Testament. And the Lord said that the priest had to wash himself before he performed any other duties after making the sacrifice, or he would die. He is not fit to carry out the ministry of the tabernacle and to picture the sacrifice of Christ if he himself is not clean. So he's to ceremonially wash himself. And remember, I already told you at this point, the laver was made from brass mirrors that the women donated. So it had a shiny mirrored surface which would help the priest see himself, to remind him of that, first of all, that the Lord sees past the outward appearance straight into the heart. Now, we don't know the size of this laver. It's talked about in Exodus 27. This is when the craftsman who made these things, his name was Bezaleel. And God told Moses that Bezaleel and his clan would be responsible for making these pieces of furniture. And they gathered up all the things. Remember when Israel left Egypt, that as they're leaving, the Egyptians come out and they give them stuff. They shower them with gold and silver and jewels and all that. Remember that Israel leaves with a high hand, which is fascinating because Pharaoh originally told Moses, okay, we'll let you go, but you can't take your stuff. And one of Moses' answers was, no, we're going all the way. We're taking everybody, we're taking everything we got. Some of you who were around September of 2012, I preached that text and that outline to say we're moving to here, to Rehoboth. And that was my point. We're going all the way. We're taking everybody. We're taking all we got. And that's what we did. And I got that from Moses by way of Adrian Rogers. Adrian Rogers told me to do that. So I used that, and that's exactly what Moses' answer to Pharaoh was. We're going all the way. We're taking everybody, taking all we got. Not only did they take all they had, the Egyptians gave them more as they left. And why did God have the Egyptians shower all this stuff on them? Not merely because the Egyptians were glad to get rid of them, which they were, because by that time all those plagues and the death of the firstborn, they wanted them gone. And so they were throwing stuff at them. Here, take this, just go. But the Lord already had a plan that he was going to take what they threw at him and he was going to use it to build the tabernacle. And that's what they did. So when Bezalel takes up the offering to give all your stuff, the women gave their mirrors and they melted that down, highly polished it, and that's how you have the bronze laver. We don't know the size of it, but it's described in Exodus 27, Exodus 40, and then in several places. And then you have New Testament references to the washing of water and the word, that kind of thing, as I've already mentioned. So that would be immediately outside the outer veil. All right, now, so you can see right there, just outside the veil is the little, the men are ministering there at that brazen laver. So the priest entered the tabernacle through the curtains at the entrance. And the tabernacle is divided into two sections. You see this place here in the front is called the holy place. And then in the back is the most holy place. Where this line is drawn right there across it is inside where the veil hung, and the Ark of the Covenant was behind the veil. Only the high priest could go behind there. So the outer place is called the holy place. The inner is the most holy place. The King James calls it the Holy of Holies. In Latin, it's the Sanctus Sanctorum. You'll also hear it called the inner sanctum. That's where that phrase comes from. So whatever you call it, the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the inner sanctum, it's that place that only the high priest goes. Now, the other Levites whose turn it was, remember that the priests are divided into 24 orders. And the priest, only when it's your turn, the turn for your order to serve, can you even go in the holy place. Remember in Luke, when Zechariah, it's his turn. He's of the course of Abiyah, and he is ministering in there all by himself, putting the incense on the altar of incense, when Gabriel appears to him and tells him that Elizabeth is going to have a son. So that is, of course, in the temple. So the tabernacle is made of, that part we looked at is made of goat's hair with a covering, with a linen covering underneath it. It had a ram skin covering dyed red, and then it had a skin of covering that could come from badger or porpoise or sea cow, which I guess manatee. and they could use those hides. And so you had a covering with basically 3 different coverings: goat's hair with linen, ram skin dyed red, and then a sort of a leather covering that came from badgers, porpoises, or manatees. The tabernacle is made of 48 boards, 100 sockets, 96 of them silver sockets for the boards, but 4 under the pillars of the veil. Now, I've heard people say, okay, try and come up with what that means, what each number means, all that. The Bible never says that. I'm not going to venture any kind of a guess, because I think if God wanted us to know that these 96 sockets stand for X, he would have told us that. I think they stand for keeping the veil on. That's all. And not everything is assigned meaning. If it's assigned meaning, I think we're told that. But the point is that none of this is left to their ingenuity. God tells them specifically what he wants done, how he wants it done. So whether the bars, the pillars, the hooks, the curtains at the entrance, the precise measurements, all that is spelled out in Exodus chapter 25 and 26. And it's very, very specific. That's the courtyard. But now, look inside the holy place. Okay, so the holy place, fairly small. Right there behind him, what you're looking at there is, so there's the veil. On the other side of that veil is the mercy seat, and the Ark of the Covenant. There's the lampstand, the table of bread of the presence, or the table of showbread, it's called in the King James, and then the altar of incense. So let's take a look at what's inside the holy place. All right, you see there a picture of the lampstand. The Bible never gives the dimensions of the lampstand. It's pretty large. I'm sure. Obviously, it can be bigger than the dimensions of the thing, and it's. I think about as I have seen one that they have, the one they claim they've made for the third temple. In fact, if you're in Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter, right in front of, there's a synagogue there, and they've got that Temple Institute has their menorah, their golden lampstand set up right there. Some of you that have been to Israel with me have seen this. We walked by it. In fact, it's a place where we typically meet. Jared, you remember it out there? And so it's about what, yay high, I'd say. Of course, they've got it set up in a case with glass around it, but it's just out there in the open. And they claim whenever they get rid of the Dome of the Rock and rebuild when they build the third temple, that will be the lampstand in it. They may or may do that. I may or may not do that. I do not know. I'll say this. I don't think it has anything to do with Bible prophecy, if they do or if they don't, because I think all this is fulfilled in Christ. And that's the reality is, I think if they were ever going to get rid of the Dome of the Rock, they'd have done it at the end of the 6-Day War when they had the shot, and they did not. So it would be nothing short of a world war if they did it. I mean, you'd have every Muslim nation rise up against Israel. It'd be a mess. But there are a group of Orthodox Jews, and they are largely supported by American evangelicals who are planning this. Again, planning it and having the support of the Israeli government and support of the world and all that, very, very different things. And I know there are Christians who are dispensational Christians who say, oh, they believe God's going to do this. I just say, why would God do that? It makes no sense to me, because the temple and the tabernacle are now obsolete because Christ has fulfilled the things that they looked forward to. Why would God go backwards? Why, when the book of Hebrews says this man offered one sacrifice for sins forever and sat down at the right hand of God, and the whole book of Hebrews is about don't go back to the law, don't go back to the sacrifices, don't go back. It makes no sense to me that there would be any going back that God would approve of when the whole book of Hebrews says don't do that. And so to me it's a major issue for those that believe that somehow prophecy points to a third temple. I think it doesn't. I think what it points to is the temple in heaven that is the presence of God and the throne of God. So this pictures that. And I just think we don't need another picture. Why do we need another picture? What we await now is the reality, the fulfillment in heaven. So the holy place, every day the priests enter into the holy place to serve the Lord, and inside you've got the table of the bread, the 7-branch golden lampstand, and the altar of incense in front of the veil that separates the holy place from the much smaller area, the most holy place. The holy place is 10 cubits wide. That means it's 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, 20 cubits long. So, 15 by 30, and then that's described in Exodus 26 and verse 33. In it are the golden lampstand, and it was the only thing that provided light in there. Remember, it's totally dark, total darkness except for this golden lampstand. And the priests trimmed the wicks to keep them burning brightly. It was made from a single piece of gold. It was not pieced together. So it's like it's a monolith. It's not like if you look at most ancient columns, they're drums that they've stacked on top of each other. You go to Bet Shan, you'll see how when these columns collapse that the drums separated. I've lost. It's a single piece of gold, which, you think about the worth of that. And when you go fast forward to Nebuchadnezzar, when he besieges Jerusalem in 586, and even before that, he starts taking the treasures. We don't know at which point he took this, but there is a bas-relief that shows them, shows at one point soldiers walking off with this. And I'm trying to remember, I think I think that one's from the Second Temple period, though. I think it's one of Roman soldiers walking off with it. So they rebuilt the golden lampstand. It's not the one that Nebuchadnezzar took off. We don't know about the Ark of the Covenant. It never shows up again after 586 BC. There's absolutely no mention of it in Old Testament, New Testament. We really don't know if they ministered with or without it. But the golden lampstand is one piece, and they made it out of that one piece. Yeah, I just simply have no notes here. So let me just ask any questions. Somebody bail me out. Ask a question that I might know. Mark? Yeah, it's a good question, and we're not told. I assume that it's daily cleaned. The thing that gets me is like when they sprinkle the blood in front of that, and the tabernacle, after it gets to in the land, it stays at Shiloh for a long time. So I have wondered about that. You just think about the practical nature of it, and I've got to believe that they cleaned it up daily, like that there's a process by which every day that has to be cleaned. I don't think it would be left, and you're starting fresh. But we're never told that. I'm trying to think. There's no place in the Bible where it talks about them cleaning it, but they would just have to, But only the priest are allowed to touch any part of it. The only exception to that is maybe the mercy seat, and I think the blood probably stays on that because they're not allowed to touch that, and that's just once a year that it's sprinkled, and it's just sprinkled. It's not like poured out. So, but everything else I would assume has to be clean, including they probably had some kind of a basin or something that they sprinkled that blood in front of the tabernacle, the tent, the veil, where they could then take it out. Because you're right, it just flies and vermin and all kinds of things that it would seem like it would be a problem. And I just believe that they would keep it clean. But it's never discussed. Rose?
Another question.
Yeah, she's talking about just the sheer numbers of the sacrifices. You're right. This is why it becomes a business. Again, it's not radically different between tabernacle and temple, but when you get to Jerusalem, it becomes a big business. But it's a lot of blood. Now, frankly, this is not unique to Israel. Pagan nations do this too. You just got, like even in Athens. And this is why Paul talks to the Romans about eating meat, sacrifice the blood. Every morning they have ritual sacrifices, and then the meat goes to the market where it's sold and becomes a part of the business. But up on the Acropolis in Athens, you're just slaughtering hundreds of animals every day, if not thousands. And in Jerusalem, that becomes absolutely the case. And in the Dome of the Rock, I've been in there once and seen it, underneath the Dome of the Rock. This was back in 1976 when they would let you go in there. They used to let you, even in the 90s, they would let us go in, but you couldn't go underneath. I've been underneath. In the Dome of the Rock, there's a big rock, and it's got a hole in it that drains down into a cavern underneath, and then there was basically like a waterwork thing that goes through the side of the mountain down into the brook Kidron. And one conjecture is that that's where they slaughtered the animals on the Dome of the Rock, on the Temple Mount, where the site of the Dome of the Rock is now, and that there is a way for the blood to drain out. And they did, there's no question, thousands of it. Josephus talks about it in detail. And of course, John has Jesus dying at the precise moment they're slaughtering the Passover lambs. And there would have been thousands of them. When you're coming to Jerusalem for the Passover, on the road with you are lots of shepherds and sheep. It is a huge business. You're right, it involves a lot of slaughter, a lot of blood. It is gallons of blood and meat, and that's why it's a festival time. But they had practical ways of dealing with it. I think it got easier once they had a permanent place. But when the tabernacle was set up in the wilderness and then later in Shiloh, and by the way, at Shiloh, it's up on that central mountain range. So again, you can easily drain stuff. Out in the desert, I think it was probably a lot harder for them. And flies in the desert are awful. When we were at the Jordan River, the site of the baptism of Jesus this time, it's out in the dry part, just right north of the Dead Sea. Flies, the last 2 times I've been there, were just awful. And at Qumran, and anything that they can light on, they do. So I got to believe it was a problem. Just dealing with the flies and all those things from it. That's why I think they had to clean it, because you couldn't just let that accumulate. But it's big business. It was no two ways about it. They had to come up with creative ways of dealing with it. Yeah, Bruce? Yeah, so it depends on the sacrifice, but yeah, basically every family, and especially the father, is responsible for it. Frankly, it gets complicated because in Exodus, you have them observing the Passover in their homes. In the New Testament, you have them observing the Passover in Jerusalem. And so, did they all go? I mean, they were supposed to, but it's certain that not everybody went. So did they observe it in their homes? If you stayed in, Capernaum and didn't go to Jerusalem for the Passover, did you still have a Passover meal? There are certain things like that are sort of unclear to us because you see it practiced different ways, even between the Old and the New Testament, between the Exodus and then once they're in the land. But when it comes to the sacrifices, every family was supposed to do it. I mean, this is why, you see Joseph and Mary going to the temple to dedicate Jesus on that 40th day. I mean, they're fulfilling the law. You see when Jesus is 12, they're going for the Passover. I mean, they are rigorously keeping the law. So, it's every family was supposed to do it. Now, they don't do it. I don't want to suggest that they all did it. In fact, I would suggest they probably, I don't even know if a majority did it. We know by the exile that they've not kept a Sabbath. They've not kept a year of Jubilee. They've not let the land lie fallow every 7 years. I mean, this is one of the things God says when he sends them into exile. So the fact that they would not do those things, but they would rigorously keep the sacrifices those odds are low. So I've just got to believe you. This is one way that you see faithfulness. One of my favorite sermons, I preached this sermon back in my 20s, and I still like it, that's unusual. But even before I went to seminary, I preached a sermon called When It Seems God Has Lied. I preached it here at Buck Run about Athaliah when she was queen, basically queen mother, but her son dies, and she's the daughter of, Ahab and Jezebel, but she's married the king of Judah. He dies, so her son becomes a puppet king through whom she rules. When he dies, she goes and kills all her grandchildren, which means she wipes out the line of David. And that's the way the Bible reads. It says that she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. She kills her own grandchildren, so none of them reign as king. But that means she's wiped out the line of David, as far as anyone knows. But then we're told the detail that for 6 years, one of her grandsons, Joash, is hidden by the high priest Jehoiada and his wife Jehoshabeath, and they hide him for 6 years. Nobody even knows he's alive. And you think about the fact that people kept offering sacrifices during those 6 years, even though it looks like God has lied. Because, God promised David he would always have a descendant on the throne. But there's 6 years, it looks like there are no descendants of David on the throne. There is no descendant of David left. Can you continue to serve God when it looks like, based on your information, he's not told you the truth? And we know that a lot of them did, because when Joash is finally revealed as the king, he's 7 years old, and Jehoiada brings him out in the temple. And it's the people who are worshiping at the temple who then see him and begin to cheer and cry, long live the king. And Athaliah hears it, and she immediately begins to scream, treason, treason. She knows what's happening. And it's a fascinating look to me into the heart and mind of people who are faithful to God, even when the world around them doesn't make sense. Even when it looks like God's not kept his promise, they have a faith that, I know it looks bad, but he has. You just trust one way or another this is going to come out, that God has been faithful to his promise. And they continue to make sacrifices. I'm also convinced, though the text doesn't tell us, that a bunch of people didn't. But the ones who were there worshiping at the temple are the ones who see the king. And I think that's always a pattern throughout Israel's history. This is why, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul makes the argument that even though all our fathers were led by the sea, the cloud, and they passed through the sea, they were baptized into Moses in the sea and the cloud, and They ate that spiritual food and they drank from that rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with the majority of them, God was not pleased, and they were decimated in the wilderness. It's a reminder to us that simply going through the routine and the ritual doesn't save you. Paul makes that case in 1 Corinthians 10, that it's faith. And only those who did this in faith were genuinely saved. You can be a member of a Baptist church and show up every week, and you can be a tither and still go to hell. And you could be an Israelite and offer the sacrifices and observe the feast and still die lost. And it's a reminder that it's faith that God commends. It's faith that he counts as righteousness. Great, you guys are asking good questions. But there's some of these things we just don't know, because you hear less about the normal than you do the abnormal. The Bible is, remember, a series of things written about crises. There's no chapter in the Bible that just goes, well, they got up that day and they did their work and they ate their food and they went to bed that night. That doesn't exist. It's always something happens that interrupts the normal. So some of these questions we have about, like, well, how did the normal thing, what was the normal act? Well, we don't know. We don't get that picture. Other questions? Well, I've dribbled to the end of my time here, and hopefully next week Matt, it's on Matt next week. He's going to teach on the feast, and we'll talk about the feast, and then I'll come back to the tabernacle furniture the week following, okay? Thanks for being here. Lord bless, and I look forward to worshiping with you in a few moments.